Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's such an honor to be here. As Alison mentioned, I actually studied at the Art Student League in the 90s, and when I first came to New York, the League was kind of the first place that I came here as a student, an international student from the UK, and the League played a seminal role in my formation and development as an artist in New York, and introduced me to a lot of the people that became part of the circle that I moved in, that sort of introduced me to a whole other side of New York. And that was the League was one of the main reasons I also came to New York, because I wanted to be a part of a place that was history. Specifically, I was very interested in the New York abstract movement, and for me, the League was this place that represented that kind of movement, and therefore I came to New York as a student to study here. I'm very grateful for the League for giving me the opportunity to come back here after many years to speak and to present my work. So basically, I would show some films as well as some stills, and talk a little bit about my early formation and where I'm at today, and we'll open it after for some questions. Yeah. Usually when I give this talk, I never really talk about the place that I come from, which is really going way, way back. I was born on Petit Martinique, which is a small island in the Grenadines. It belongs to Grenada. Grenada has several small islands, Carriacou being one of them, and Petit Martinique being the smallest of them. So this is the island that I was born on. It was a French colony for 100 years, then became a British colony, and it's known for its tradition of boat building. My dad was a boat builder and a fisherman, and also a captain of boats on the island. And these are boats that were sort of inspired or come from a Scottish tradition. Grenada and Carriacou and Petit Martinique, a lot of the Caribbean islands are mainly African and Scottish, kind of synthesis of many other cultures. There's also French as well in the mix. But, so I'm basically a creature of post-colonial Caribbean upbringing, and my Caribbean, Afropean background kind of created for me and informed the conditions and the formations of my practice as an artist and a filmmaker today. I think it was very important to talk about this because when I think of the Caribbean and the artists and the people like my dad who were boat builder, they never really gave themselves the title of being an artist. They did not really depend on basically the agency of Western culture or Western titles in order to be an artist. They just make art because it was made out of necessity. So these people who made these incredible boats never called themselves artists. They just did this out of necessity. And I think it's important to give them sort of a voice, because the place I grew up on, and usually the whole community is part of this boat building. This is a boat launched, and this is a regatta, Carriacou, which is one of the oldest running regatta in the Western Hemisphere. And these boats, my dad had many boats that take part in regattas, and I talk a lot of my dad in my own work, because my work is autobiographical intervention, if you will, out of fiction, that looks at the personal as well as the collective, mine and colonial history, as well as my own African ancestry. And the tradition and rituals around the Caribbean has really much helped to inform a lot of the today, and my own practice as a multimedia artist and a filmmaker. I show this work in order to say that the place that I came from gave me the agency to be able to move in various practices as an artist. I think maybe if I was born in the UK or somewhere else, I might not have had that level of creative freedom that I have today as an artist, because I don't necessarily depend on an institution to give me the title or the agency to create and to make work, and I think it's very much, so I want to dedicate this talk in a way almost to the outsider artists and the outliners, like my dad, who make work for many years but never gave themselves any kind of accolades that we normally assume or kind of connect to the art world here in the Western world. Okay? This is early works that I did at the Art Student League of New York. These were while I was working, and I'm not quite remember who I was studying with at the time, but the first one was based, I was making work that was based on people who were exiled. Exile is a theme that comes up a lot in my work. So the one to the gentleman, that is Camus. I was very much inspired by Camus at the time. This is based on the book, the famous book, The Stranger. And the other work is Anna Akhmatova, who is a Russian poet that I really loved at the time, and I was reading a lot of Anna Akhmatova work. And I was introduced to Anna Akhmatova's work through John Holdberg. Does anyone here know who John Holdberg is? John Holdberg was a painter, an abstract painter who worked and studied at the League for many years. And when I first came to New York, I met him in the cafe in the Art Student League of New York, and he was looking for an assistant. And I went on to become his assistant and was his assistant for 5 years. He was married to Lynn Dressler, who's getting a lot of attention right now in her work. And he spent a lot of time in Montego Island in Maine. And so I was introduced, because I love sailing, he introduced me to Montego Island and all the artists that was part of that movement who went to Montego Island at the time. And John Holdberg was sort of a bit of an outsider as well. He was actually, when I was working with him at the time, he considered himself more a poet than a painter, and he didn't really want to paint anymore. So I had the difficulties of trying to motivate him to paint. At the time, I was making really small pieces, and John Holdberg insisted that I make large canvases, and if I made anything small, he was just kind of like slashed it, and it was like, and I destroyed a lot of this work at the time because I was constantly moving, and it was sort of an exile, if you will, because I had sort of imposed a kind of poetic exile. That was something that I was drawn to. I did not return back to the Caribbean until 18 years later when I went back to make the Venice Biennale work. I'm sort of rambling right now, so I'll just keep moving. This is a John Holdberg piece, Blue. I really love this piece, and I don't really paint as John Holdberg on my work when I think of my new abstract work. It's definitely more influenced by people like Robert Rauschenberg, who was a friend of John Holdberg, and he was part of that whole school of painter at the time. So this is sort of works of Holdberg that was inspired my work in a way. And this is a large canvas that I did in John Holdberg's studio in the Lower East Side at the time. He didn't have any money to pay me, so I had access to paint in his studio at night, and was able to make this type of the scale of this work because I had access to this large studio. So this body of work, Truth is Contrary, is a body of work I started to develop maybe like 10 or 15 years. I was interested in exploring what was happening at the time, social uprisings, things connected to the war in Iraq, issues regarding the hijab in France. So I wanted to look at that through the lens of this multimedia work that is a mix of painting as well as photographic work. I archive, a lot of my work is pulled from the media and archives as well. So this is work that was made during that time, around 2010. And these are images of, that was in the New York Times at the time. I save a lot of front covers of the New York Times. And this was an image from a young boy who was killed in Iraq during the war there with the United States. I use a lot of text in my work as well, and this is a text that was that inspired me because it was taken from William Butler Yeats, but also it was the prologue to the White Album by Joan Didion. And the White Album was basically exploring California, that whole movement in the 1960s. And I was very inspired by the book, but also inspired by this text. And this text for me kind of sums up the body of work and what I was doing at the time. And this one is looking at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is still kind of relevant today, some of this work. As I mentioned, a lot of my work is inspired by and culled from the media. So this is sort of just books and things in my studio, articles that I pull from. While I was working for John Holberg, he really encouraged me to do collage work and to use this almost as a journal, if you will. So for people who are students, I'm a big proponent of keeping a journal. And for me, a journal could be a video journal, or it could be these types of archival material that I pull that later comes into my work. And I still continue making these books. And these articles and these kinds of way of working really inspire even the film work that I do. This body of work, Le Fin de Dialogue, it was made while I was living in France in 2005. It's sort of, the work was inspired by these two young boys who was electrocuted while they were trying to escape the police, and this set out a series of riots that took place in France. So I'm using the color of the French flag, as well as burning things. During the riot, thousands of cars were burned. It lasted for 2 weeks. It started in the banlieue and it spread all through Paris. So the body of work entailed films that I shot, stills, as well as canvases. I was, again, very inspired by this Martin Luther King quote, because at the time when I was making the work and when I presented it to France, the mayor of the town where I presented the work was very upset with me and wanted to know why I was making work about France. I didn't have the right, in other words. And this is a really interesting conversation because it goes into who has the right to tell another story. And as someone who kind of see myself as a global citizen and has made this type of work my whole life, I felt that, I had the right, specifically that Grenada and the island that I came from was a French colony for over 100 years. So I was trying to explain this to this mayor who was really upset that I was making work that was looking at France's history and this entangled relationship that France has with its Arab and African community that they're not willing to face. This canvas was made on a cotton linen that came from one of the boys' mother. It was her bed sheet. I went to the neighborhood and interviewed a lot of the people that was involved and the both mothers, and I asked if I could take something from the boys' room, and she said, no, but you can have this tablecloth where we had our meals almost every night. So the work is made on cotton linen that came from actually Morocco. So this work is in my collection. I might never part with it because it has a lot of symbolic meaning for me. But on the canvas, you can see there is articles that was pulled from the front page of different magazines, Le Point, March, in France, of what was happening at the time. And I guess the reason why the mayor was so upset over the work is because I was also using the color of the French flag and burning the paper. So this was problematic in its own self. And this was all part of the install of the work. The two candles, of course, represented the boys. And there was also some performance art around this as well. And during the time I was living in France, there was also a lot of controversy regarding the hijab. And in France, it was banned, women were banned from wearing the hijab. It's a very interesting topic to explore, right? Considering what's happening in the Middle East around women not wanting to wear it. During the time when this was happening, thousands they felt that the way France was doing it, they didn't have the right. It was basically banned and they couldn't wear it. And I went to a lot of the demonstrations as well. And interestingly enough, the image in the center is Ayatollah Khomeini. And I think it's just still a very timely piece of work. Of course, France always like to consider themselves as, liberté, equalité, fraternité. But that does not always extend to the people from Arab and African countries who live in France. So this body of work is a very personal body of work. I was in 2019, I was invited to represent Grenada in the Venice Biennale. And before that, I went back to Grenada to visit my dad that I was estranged from over 18 years. And when I was in Grenada, I found a suitcase containing maps and letters and various mementos that kind of constituted the archives of his life and his own entangled relationship with his own father and generation of exile and estrangement. So this was sort of the instigator for this whole body of work, which included film installation, which you would see a part of, paintings, as well as stills from the film. Usually when I'm working as an artist, I work in themes, and there's usually sculpture, or there's usually a film installation, or there might be performance, or there might be stills from the film, or paintings. And I'm able to move in these various mediums, but what really, for me, drives the work is the theme and the ideas that I'm exploring, and the ideas and themes are more important sometimes than the actual subject of the work. And this, of course, is one of my favorite quotes from V.S. Naipaul. Coming from the Caribbean, I was very much inspired. When I left Grenada, I really wanted to be a writer before I went to the UK, because we were more exposed to literature. Some of the people that was very key in my life, of course, at the time, V.S. Naipaul being one of them, Stuart Hall, who is a very important theorist in the UK who coined the phrase multiculturalism. People like Jamaica Kincaid were all writers who inspired my work, and I use a lot of text throughout my work, and writing and text and literature continue to inform my practice and my work as an artist. So this large canvas was in Biennale with the suitcase that I mentioned that I found. The suitcase is usually opened, and there's letters, personal letters as exchanged between me and my dad, but also letters as exchanged between my dad and his siblings who left to go to the UK or America. The person in the center of the image is actually my dad. Some of the images are silk screened onto the canvas. There is a boat to the side because he was a boat builder. And I was also looking at my own relationship with lovers as well. So there were postcards and other letters that was included in the installation, because I felt it was important to look at that, because a lot of my relationship with my own lovers were also very archaic patterns that stem from my own relationship with my dad in terms of the kind of people that I was dating at the time. So I think it was very important to include that as part of the exhibition. And this is just an install of the work with some stills as well from the film. And normally I would bring a photographer on set who would take photographs. So after I shoot the film, after I shoot a scene, the photographer come on set and the set is lit in a different way, and they would shoot stills that becomes part of the exhibition. In this case, with this film, I wanted to work with the film still. So I did not bring a photographer on set for that reason, because I knew that I was going to be shooting in 4K and I was going to be able to pull certain high-res stills from the film itself. And this is just, the heart, of course, is my dad's heart. There's ties, there's other things as well, and letters. And the audience actually could read the letters during the exhibition. This is letters that was transferred onto a silk screen. That's my dad, and that's me as a teenager, and this is done on HD aluminum panels, and this is a diptych, and these works are like fairly big works as well. And maybe we can turn the lights off now. So the film, there's Second Eulogy, Mind the Gap, and I can start it now.
Do you know your father? What's his name? Do you know your grandfather? And your great-great-grandfather? And what about your mother? Who are these people to you? Speak your grievances or hold your peace. What is your father's name, boy?
So the film is about 40 minutes long, and this was like minutes of it, but I felt that, you know, what I've shown so far gives you an idea of the world and themes in which the film live in terms of autobiographical intervention, mining the personal, collective, colonial history, and the place that I came from and the influence and formation of that place in my own life, specifically when one looked at this, say, vis-a-vis other filmmakers like John Okomfra or people like Isaac Julian, who work and mine a similar type of narrative. I think what's maybe unique about this work in that sense is because I come from the place and have a deeper relationship to the landscape. And in this kind of work for me, I kind of see this as sort of like, when we talk about the Caribbean, specifically Grenada, there is still laws around buggery that still exist, and specifically when talking about decolonization. And for me, we can't really talk about decolonization when some of these laws are still in place. And I'm curious to see on many levels, we have a new prime minister, and with what's happening with England now with the new king, how a lot of the Caribbean island is going to redress some of these issues regarding, I think there's over 64 nations in the world that was former British colonies that still has buggery laws and different things in place. So for me personally, this work is also the idea for me is juxtaposing queer bodies with uncertain landscape that reinterpreting and deconstructing some of our own tradition in a new form. So that's kind of what I was trying to do here with this work as well. So this is the new work that was in the Venice Biennale last year, Palinset's Tale Spawned from Sea and Memories. It is based on the life of Kugwano, who was a major abolitionist in 18th century England. He was kidnapped in Ghana as a teenager at the age of 16 by Africans and brought to Grenada as a slave. In Grenada, he was bought by Alexander Campbell, who was a Scottish business merchant and plantation owner in Grenada, who brought him to England as his personal sovereign. In England, Kugwano gained his freedom and became a prominent figure in the abolitionist movement. He went to work for Richard Cosway, who was an appointed painter for the royal family. And while Kugwano was working there, he gained his freedom. He changed his name to John Stewart. And that was a way of gaining one's freedom as well, or at least the slaves thought they would gain their freedom at the time. So he went to work when he gained his freedom for Richard Cosway, who was a libertine as well. Richard Cosway was married to Maria Cosway, who was also a painter. And this work is in the National Gallery in England, and also there's a copy of it at the Yale British Center, and I got the rights from the Yale British Center to use it in the film. But this is Kugwano. The only image we have of Kugwano is serving Richard Cosway and Maria Cosway grapes in obviously a subservient position because he was a slave. Some interesting notes about Maria Cosway. She was the lover of Thomas Jefferson, and the film Jefferson in Paris. The relationship, the lover that he had in the film is Maria Cosway. Richard Cosway died in a mental institution. There are rumors that he was gay. We don't know that, but I was very curious when I was exploring. So Kugwano died in obscurity, so he wrote a very seminal book called Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evils of Slavery. And the film is loosely based on the book. I had the rights for the book. And I also was thinking of Kugwano's life from the position of double consciousness in terms of how do I bring this into a contemporary setting. I was very inspired by Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, and I wanted to bring it into a more contemporary setting. The lead actor who plays Kugwano is Jeremy Rory, who is a Broadway actor. He was in Thriller and The Lion King and many other projects. He's Jamaican descendant but lives here in the United States, and he also worked in Great Britain because for me it was very important to find a voice that could capture this global triangular trade, and also to look at somebody who was able to move in this multiple spaces. Again, all the work. So this time I did bring a photographer and set to photograph because I was looking for something very specific. This work is going to the Butler Institute of American Art, an exhibition that opens in a week time. And this is kind of an idea of how the work is presented. There's stills from the film that is an 18th century frame. Next to him is a someone dressed in a Shakespeare costume. So Karakou, this island next to Grenada that belongs to Grenada, is one of the few islands that has this tradition where people dress up in Shakespeare, in these costumes that is an influence of West Africa as well as France and England, the British Mummeras, and they perform Shakespeare, Julius Caesar. And when one person gets it wrong, they kind of hit them with a stick. So that was a still from the film. The theme of the Venice Biennale was Milk of Dream, and I had to think of a way of incorporating certain themes around the Biennale in the work. So the character, the young Cubano in Grenada cries blue milk in the film. And there was also a sculpture that was part of the installation and in the Biennale. And this was a West African mask and a contemporary mask that I designed to imitate the Shakespeare mask. And it was set in resin and set side by side in the pavilion, in this resin. And as you move around it, it gives this illusion of a 3D effect, which is something I was going for because I was thinking of this idea of double consciousness in Cubano. The work is, there's also a teaspoon of indigo in the resin to give it a feel of the ocean, and the mask itself was further distressed to make it felt like it was under the ocean for a very long time. And this work is going to a private collection, family collection in Amsterdam. So I'm going to show like minutes of the film and maybe one or two more pieces, and yeah, brilliant.
A time will come when you will journey to distant and unknown lands. Cross many oceans, rivers, and continents. See the treachery of men in all forms. Walk among dignitaries and kings. Speak with foreign tongues. Confront people and places. But remember where you come from and what is your name.
So based on time, I'm just going to show two more pieces of work and then we can open it up to Q&A. This is a new body of work called Indigo Entanglements. It's sort of connected to this palimpsest work, but it's very different. It's a large painting, silk screens, looking at the entangled relationship with the transatlantic slave trade. All of the work has the Bank of England logos stamped onto it. And this work is going in the Butler Institute of American Art exhibition. They're fairly large pieces. They're over 10 feet by 8. And this work was just acquired by the Farnsworth Museum in Maine. And it's looking at Maine's entangled relationship with slavery. The piece has the African company logo on it, and the African company logo was entirely owned by the Crown. So that's it.
All right, thank you so much, Billy. If anyone is still working on their question as you complete it, just hold it up. Mealy in the back, thank you. Mealy is going to come around and grab those questions. Billy, you've been super generous with your time already, so in our time remaining, we're just going to take a couple of audience questions. Let me start with this one. I'm so curious, seeing how much narrative goes into all of these works. When your work is presented in a not film context and we're seeing it in exhibition, I'm curious what your relationship is with audience at that point. Is there wall text that explains the historical stories? Are you inviting interpretation of these more abstract combined media images?
It's a mix of both, because some of the work that you've seen, whenever they were exhibited, there were always some kind of text involved, and usually with my work there was always some kind of because my work, because I'm an educator as well, the work always incorporates some kind of talk or conversation with the audience. But also, I like the idea that the work is up for interpretation as well by the audience.
Thank you. Sorry, we're viewing lots of really great insights here from our watching audience. So a question of curiosity, which comes from Janet, your work bravely addresses issues throughout a lot of different historical scenarios here. Any consideration of the 80s conflict in Grenada? Just out of curiosity, to what extent are more contemporary issues playing a role in the stories that you're sharing?
Yeah. The revolution is what the person is referring to. That took place in Grenada. There was the United States went to Grenada, what they would call an invasion then, but it was basically a conflict with Maurice Bishop, who was killed, the leader there, and I had considered this project before as a larger project that is more like a TV series or some kind of essay film, but it's a very expensive project to undertake, and for the moment I'm not drawn to it to explore it in that level, because it's a very complex story, and I'm aware that it needs a lot of time, and there's still a lot of healing and unanswered questions regarding the revolution in Grenada. In fact, during COVID, I went to Grenada with the idea to do some project around it, and I was reading a lot of books and interviewing people, and the Kurwana story kind of came to me in that process and sort of took over.
It makes sense. I think we can imagine that as so much of your work is a full-scale production, selecting these stories and the materials that accompany them, it would take a lot of care, because it does take a lot of time. This is an interesting question that almost comes from the reverse in terms of timeline and your personal timeline. And as an international student, what were the initial feelings from that perspective that motivated maybe the work that you started here at the League?
The League, yeah. So when I came to the League, I was already, I was coming from an art program in the UK, and I was interested in the League in the sense that I felt that I needed to do more painting. I wanted I was very much influenced by the New York School of Abstraction, what was happening in the USA, what came before and after. And the League kind of did provide me that sort of space to explore that more. And as I mentioned, I met people like John Holberg, who knew people like Clifford Steele and all these other painters, and was introduced to a whole host of other artists that helped to influence my work. I think Robert Rauschenberg had played a very important part in this, specifically in this type of narrative that is looking at sort of global history, sort of personal as well as collective, and the way he used painting to really tell this larger stories. I think the League kind of provide me that sort of space to do that.
Yeah, well, cheers to that. Yeah, I think we can see like both narrative and formal elements are really, inspired by some of these artists that you were exposed to being in this context for the first time. And I think this is a great question that we can end on, and lingering on this moment of your experience as a student, knowing that you today are an educator, what advice do you have to students who are tuning in today?
I would just say just being true to yourself. As I mentioned, I spoke about my formation growing up in a small place, and the level of creative freedom it gave me to do the kind of work that I do today. I think it's, for me, it would be to be true to your own self, your own narrative, your own story. A lot of my work mines my own personal history, explore my own identity, autobiographical intervention. That is a space I always encourage artists or filmmakers to start within their own practice, rather than trying to imitate other people. And I think it's important to look at history and look at other artists and what they've done, and the influence of that is very important. I've mentioned there's a lot of people that influence my work, but you have to really be true to your own voice and your own work. And out of that comes the collective, the historical, all of that sort of is conflated when you begin to look at your own personal narrative. And we all have a story to tell.
I think that couldn't be a more perfect note to end on. Thank you for sharing so much of your voice with us tonight.
So thank you everyone who came out today.